Okay, so thank you everybody for coming to this teach-in on Jews and the Socialist Movement, where UChicago Platypus will be hosting Professor Tony Michels. So just briefly on introducing Platypus. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. And just to briefly introduce Professor Tony Michels, who's going to present this teach-in. Tony Michels teaches American Jewish history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the author of A Fire in Their Hearts, Yiddish Socialists in New York, editor of Jewish Radicals, A Documentary History, and is currently finishing a book with the working title Jews and Revolution, From the United States to Russia and Back. And now to read out the prompt that was provided to Professor Tony Michels for this teach-in. In the 19th and early 20th century, a significant number of Jews participated in the international socialist movement at the time of the Second International, the largest organization of socialist parties in the world, including prominent Jewish-born leaders such as Grigory Zinoniev and Julius Martov. In America, too, Jews played a major role in the Socialist Party of America, particularly in New York elections and labor organizing. Yet, the orthodox Marxist position in the Second International was to oppose, quote, general Jewish solidarity in favor of, quote, proletarian solidarity, which meant even opposing socialist Jewish organizations such as the Jewish Labour Bund. In the aftermath of the 1917 Russian Revolution and the rise of international anti-Semitism, which culminated in the Holocaust as well as the foundation of the State of Israel, the relation between Jews and the official socialist movement became more ambiguous and even antagonistic. In the present Israel-Palestine conflict, the interests of Jews and the socialist movement have sometimes even been explicitly opposed. What was the orthodox Marxist position on the Jewish question in the time of the Second International? What were the reasons for this position? What explains the significant Jewish participation in the international socialist movement at that time, especially in America? How did the relation between Jews and the socialist movement change historically? When did these changes take place and why, particularly around the State of Israel? What is the meaning of this history for the present? So without further ado, Tony, you can take it away.
Thank you very much, Desmond, and to the Platypus Society for inviting me to speak on this very big topic, which I will do my best to cover and in my comments, and then I'll speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll go to questions and discussion. So I'll start this way. I'll start by addressing a term that I don't think Desmond used in his comments, his introductory comments, but you also often see in discussions, historical discussions of the subject, certainly in contemporary discussions of Jews and socialism going back to the 19th century, and that is the term the Jewish question. You sometimes see the term the Jewish problem, but most often, I believe, the Jewish question. And I'll define that. Well, the term has different meanings over time and place. So the Jewish question can mean anti-Semitism, why it exists, how to fight it, what is it, those sorts of questions. Questions having to do with violence against Jews, discrimination against Jews, prejudice against Jews, and so forth. That's one aspect of the Jewish question, historically. Another aspect has to do with immigration. Where Jews should Jews emigrate from Europe or other countries where they're living to deal with the myriad problems they were facing? If so, where should they go? So immigration was a facet of the Jewish question. Another part of it had to do with the question of a Jewish homeland. Should a Jewish homeland be created? Or if not a homeland, some other territorial solution. The Jewish question could also include seemingly smaller issues like party structure or party organization. Namely, did Jews need their own separate political organizations to deal with the issues that they were confronting? That could be grouped under that term, the Jewish question. So there's also the question of assimilation. Should Jews anticipate and welcome, or should socialists more broadly anticipate and welcome assimilation or not? So the Jewish question, again, a single term was used as a catch-all for any number of issues or all these issues, depending on time and place. Even in the United States, you'd hear this term, the Jewish question, not just Europe or elsewhere. So I think this a good way to discuss the kinds of questions that Desmond raised, having to do with the relationship of Jews to socialism, can be organized around this term, the Jewish question, keeping in mind that term had multiple facets to it and meant different things to different people at different times. So I'll start off by saying that by describing the orthodox Marxist position during the era of the Second International from the 1880s until its collapse during World War I. And then in those comments, I'm going to try to turn to the Russian Empire for reasons I'll explain, and then to the United States. I'll be focusing a lot on the United States, and in part because this is where we are, this is where we live, and also because that's my area of specialty, geographic area of specialty. So the orthodox Marxist position in the era of the Second International was basically this. It was assimilationist, meaning there was an expectation among the major Marxist thinkers and many socialists that Jews as a people were in the process of dissolving. That process was advanced in Western and Central European industrialized countries, democratic countries. And that process of assimilation would naturally spread to all countries that would undergo, presumably, a similar experience or development of industrialization. So the idea was that Jews were a people for many centuries, but thanks to emancipation, the granting of equal civil and political rights to Jews, and the development of an industrial capitalist economy, and the growth of cities, urbanization, that these factors were functioning to break down barriers between Jews and the majority society. In fact, the break down differences between all kinds of groups. They would be brought in gradually, but certainly inexorably, into some larger whole, and they would lose their identity as a people. That was what was meant by assimilation. In this period, it was viewed as progressive and inexorable, meaning this was a good thing, and it was positive that the Jews were going to assimilate, that their cohesive identity was going to be absorbed into the dominant classes, whether proletarian or bourgeoisie. It was good and seen as inexorable because this was understood as a almost natural development of capitalist society to bring, again, minority groups, especially a group that wasn't really in the thinking of Marxists. They weren't really a nation. They were something like a caste that was a product of centuries of discrimination and marginalization. But it's subjugated. And this process of emancipation followed by absorption was, again, seen as ending that subjugation and leading towards something larger, more integrated than existed before. So it was seen as a facet of a larger social change that was seen as good, positive for society as a whole and for Jews in particular. What went along, the argument was, along with this process of absorption, there would also be a decline in anti-Semitism, discrimination or hostility towards Jews. So this was a twin development, that discrimination and hostility and violence towards Jews would diminish, and at the same time, Jews would assimilate. That was the general view. Most socialists in this time, certainly most Marxists, opposed anti-Semitism on principle. They were against it. They favored emancipation for Jews. They opposed right-wing or reactionary parties that wanted to maintain barriers or even roll back the emancipation of Jews. Marxists opposed all that. So I want to be clear about this. On the one hand, as I say, they expected Jews to assimilate. On the other hand, they didn't want, this wasn't seen as an act of hostility towards Jews. They might not have had positive views of Jewish culture or Jews generally. That's another question, the degree to which Marxists, like many Germans or Austrians or French people, what they thought of Jews as a whole. But I'm talking about kind of at the theoretical level and the political level. Marxism did not in any way favor discrimination against Jews. They opposed it. At the same time, they didn't always oppose it strongly enough. They didn't see anti-Semitism. I'm still talking mostly about Central Europeans, but I think this applies as well to Eastern Europe. They didn't see anti-Semitism as a particularly significant problem. They thought of it as a holdover from the pre-modern era that would eventually disappear. And so, to give you an example, in 1891, the Socialist International passed a resolution, kind of an odd resolution, that denounced anti-Semitism, but it also denounced what it called philo-Semitism, meaning apparently an attitude that was particularly friendly to Jews. It was a declaration saying we oppose hatred of Jews, but we're not necessarily in favor of any special friendliness or positive action or attitudes or feelings towards Jews either. Philo-Semitism wasn't defined here, so I can't give you a precise definition or a precise explanation of what it meant. But I'm noting this to give you a sense that while anti-Semitism was opposed, certainly in principle, there wasn't any really concerted effort to deal with it. And in fact, it was not seen as a major problem. It was seen as something that would eventually disappear. There's a certain evolutionist thinking at work in this era generally, and you could see this in this understanding of the Jewish question, the view that the Jews would inexorably, sooner or later, disappear, and anti-Semitism would too. In the Russian Empire, which is where the largest number of Jews lived until World War II, Russian Empire in Eastern Europe, the situation was very different, and the Jewish question in many ways was different. So let me say a few words about the Russian Empire. First, something to note that until 1917, the Jews in the Russian Empire, this is where most Jews lived. There were about 5 million Jews who lived in the Russian Empire by 1900. In Germany, to just draw a contrast, there were about 250,000 Jews. So it's a much larger population in the Russian Empire. It's home to the largest Jewish community in the world at that time. So there are about 5 million as of 1900. Second, they had not been emancipated. The Russian Empire was a monarchy. It was not any kind of democracy. There was no emancipation process that gave equal rights to all people, equal civil and political rights. Just to put it differently, there's no concept of the citizen. And in that context, Jews were identified, unlike in France or England or Germany, they were recognized as a corporate body. In the eyes of the state, there was something called the Jews. There were a whole set of laws and decrees that applied to them during that period. So that's another difference. Second, there was not an assimilation process, certainly not in the same way that took place in Central and Western Europe. Jews lived apart from non-Jews in a lot of ways, or they had a different status in a lot of ways. Culturally, they, of course, were Jews were Jews. They practiced not Christianity, but Judaism. Most spoke Yiddish and not Russian or Polish or Ukrainian. They were highly urban. Most of the population of the time lived in villages or, in rural areas. Jews were mostly urban, lived in towns or cities. That was another difference. They were concentrated in certain occupations as traders, small, artisans, traders, and other forms of small commerce. They spoke, as I said, they spoke a different language, and we could go on. So Jews were a very distinct group, both in the eyes of the law, in their own self-perception, in their cultural and sociological differences, in the perceptions of others. Another important factor here is that there was the emergence of a Jewish working class, meaning wage workers who were finding work in factories and of larger or smaller size. So Jews were starting to get caught up by 1900 in the process of industrialization. But unlike Jews in the West, a fairly large working class was emerging, where in the West, most Jews were in the middle class and the professional class. So that affected how Jews in different countries, how socialists in different countries viewed Jews. In Eastern Europe, and especially in the Russian Empire, you have the beginning of a working class. Jews are also, as I said before, not in large numbers being assimilated. Some were being kind of acculturated into Russian culture. That's a separate question for now. But Jews were very much a distinct group. That's what I'm getting at. In one in which was becoming proletarianized, the extent of which was a debate I'll get to because it's crucial to understanding the Jewish question in Russia, but at least some portion of the Russian Jewish population was becoming transformed into a working class, a wage earning class. And these are big differences. All right. Big differences between, again, the Jews in the Russian Empire and Jews in Western Central Europe. Okay, so how did this play out in terms of socialism? Again, I want to stress here, just want to be clear to make sure, just to make sure this is clear, that this population of Russian Jews is much larger than anywhere else in Europe or elsewhere in the world, is again, continues to be quite separate and distinct from the larger non-Jewish population in myriad ways I touched on. And it's not a static population, it's one that's undergoing a sociological transformation, the nature of which there is a lot of disagreement. And again, I'm heading to that disagreement. Okay. Now, these changes that I just identified produced in the 1890s the emergence of a Jewish Workers' Party known by its nickname, the Bund. The full name is the General Jewish Workers, General Jewish Workers Federation or Alliance in Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. This is a party that first emerges in Lithuania. The people who organize, revolutionaries, Marxist revolutionaries, started organizing Jewish workers in Lithuania, not really with the desire to create a Jewish party. mainly because it was just easier to do that. These revolutionaries were Jews, and it was much easier for Jews to organize Jews than non-Jews. In 1897, various social democratic, which is to say Marxist groups, these groups were groups of workers and then revolutionary intellectuals, started forming in the Pale of Settlement. That's the region of the Russian Empire, the western region of the Russian Empire, where most Jews were confined to live. Most of those 5 million Jews lived in this region called the Pale of Settlement that goes from the Baltics down to the Black Sea, roughly speaking. And these different Marxist groups, these social democratic groups of intellectuals and workers are springing up, and they unite to form this party called the Bund. It's a Marxist Jewish party. At the beginning, this is 1897, it's the first Jewish political party in Russia, and one of the first Marxist parties of any sort in Russia. And in the beginning, it is Jewish mainly because of its composition, actually officially only because of its composition, meaning all the people in the Bund are Jews. Beyond that, it doesn't really have a Jewish program, but it will evolve in a Jewish program over the coming 8 years or so. The program that it evolves goes like this. The Jews are identified, well, first the party pledges to struggle for the rights of Jews, the civil and political rights of Jews, as part of the larger socialist struggle for a democratic Russia. This is followed by a declaration, I think it's 1901, if I'm not mistaken, in which the Bund identifies Jews as a nation. This is significant. This is the first time a political party identifies Jews as a nation, not a religious community, certainly not a caste that's kind of dissolving with the march of progress, but a nation. This is followed a few years later by a national program that the Bund adopts. And the national program basically says this, that Jews are a nation. They are a nation without a territory, but they're still a nation. And that the goals of this nation, the goal of the Bund, should be to struggle for the emancipation of the working class in league with all revolutionary workers, but also they should struggle for what the Bund calls national cultural autonomy, meaning that Jews should have control over their educational and cultural institutions. In that the language of this national cultural autonomy, which is to say the language of this Jewish nation or this working class proletarian Jewish nation, should be Yiddish, for the simple reason that that's the language that most Jews spoke in Russia. So this was highly controversial in the Russian social democratic or Marxist context for multiple reasons. First, Russian social democrats, and this includes both the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks in the beginning, don't like the idea. They oppose the idea that the Bund, that the Jews should have their own party. They view it as unnecessary and divisive. Second, they don't like the idea of national cultural autonomy. They also a lot don't like the idea of defining the Jews as a nation, because they say the Jews don't count as a nation. They don't count as a nation because they don't have a territory to call their own. Without a territory, they can't be a nation. So in the eyes of Russian social democrats like Lenin, the idea of calling Jews a nation is reactionary. The goal of national cultural autonomy is likewise reactionary. The idea that Jews have a culture separate from religion was identified as false and reactionary. And finally, the notion that Jews should have a political party of their own is divisive and unnecessary. So Russian social democrats say to the Bund, you're out of your minds, essentially. You don't understand where things are going. You don't understand that Jews will be assimilated. You have this illusion that there is a Jewish culture. There can't be a Jewish culture in an industrializing society. Jews are getting absorbed. Remember, this is what Marxists have been saying for a long time already. The Jews are being absorbed into the larger population. So there isn't going to be some sort of Jewish national cultural revival. And those that work towards that, again, are holding back the march of progress. They're trying to. They won't. They'll fail because one can't hold back the objective, is the argument, the objective social forces that are at work in society. So this is a withering critique. The hostility is very strong. If you read the polemics, if you read, let's say, Lenin's polemics against the Bund, to our ears, it sounds almost anti-Semitic. It's said with such, the critique is advanced with such hostility, such vehemence, with so little feeling or caring for the Jews. It's really jarring to read these polemics. Now, Lenin is opposed to anti-Semitism. The Russian Social Democrats oppose it on principle. They don't do a whole lot to fight it, but they're not talking about keeping Jews in a separate legal category. They're against discrimination against Jews, and they certainly oppose violence against Jews. But nonetheless, they critique the Bund for these reasons. Okay, so the Bund by the 1905 revolution does pretty well among Jews. There are an estimated 33,000 members of the Bund by the 1905 revolution, making them the largest Jewish party at that time. Now, there are a number of other parties that are workers' parties, Jewish workers' parties that arise in the wake of the Bund, and especially in and around 1905. And I'll mention three of them that are most relevant here for our discussion because they're socialist parties. One party is, in addition to the Bund, is a Marxist Zionist party. In Hebrew, in Yiddish, it's called the Poalei Zion, the Workers of Zion. This is a synthesis of Marxism and Zionism. The Marxist Zionists agree with the Bund that the Jews constitute a nation, but they have a different analysis of the Jewish situation in Russia. First, has to do with economics. The Bund argued that that Jews were becoming fully, at least Jewish. A large portion of the Jews were becoming absorbed into the emerging industrial economy of Russia. Therefore, they were becoming proletarianized. The Marxist Zionists argue that that's not happening, or it's happening, but not to that's not all that's happening. The Marxist Zionists argued that Jews, on the whole, were actually becoming pauperized, not proletarianized, meaning that they were becoming squeezed out of an emerging industrial economy. They were losing their niche in the pre-industrial era, but they were not being absorbed into industry due to a host of factors, including discrimination and anti-Semitism of one kind or another. Many of the major factories in Russia were built in the interior of Russia, where Jews weren't allowed to live unless they had special permission. So that was one problem for the Jewish working class. They couldn't migrate to where a lot of the major industrial centers, Moscow, St. Petersburg, wherever, were arising. So they lived in the geographic margins of the burgeoning Russian industrial economy. And even within this realm of the Pale of Settlement, they couldn't get employment on equal terms. The Marxist position is that Jews are becoming, again, squeezed out of the economy. They were losing their position in the old pre-industrial economy and not being absorbed into the new. And so their argument was that Jews had to leave en masse from the Russian Empire and go elsewhere. And their view was the territory they had to move to was Palestine for a host of reasons. So that's a second party that emerges, Marxist Zionism. There's a third party. This is also this is a socialist Zionist party. It's called I won't give you the full name. It's a socialist Zionist party that believes that Jews ought to leave Russia. There's no future for Jewish workers there for the reasons I just described, but didn't insist that the Jewish homeland of the future needed to be in Palestine. It could be in any number of places. Third was another party that was also Jewish and socialist. It also believed in emigration to a territory in which a Jewish nation and homeland could arise, but had greater confidence that Jews actually had confidence that there was a future for the Jews in Russia. And what they wanted, and what they emphasized, this particular party, Jewish Socialist Workers' Party was called, what it wanted was autonomy, like the Bund, except autonomy that would encompass virtually all Jewish communal affairs, not just education and culture. All right. I'm trying not to dwell too much on the details of the different programs. What these four parties, the Bund, Proletarian, the Socialist Zionists, and the Jewish Socialist Workers' Party, all had in common were the following. They were all based on a synthesis of socialism and a kind of Jewish nationalism. All believed Jews constituted a nation. All believed that that Jewish workers required both socialism and a form of Jewish national liberation. Class liberation and national liberation were fused in different ways in all these parties. So very quickly in the 1900s, there was a mass politicization of an emerging Jewish working class or underclass, depending on who you're talking to, that resulted in these kinds of parties. I also mentioned, I want to reiterate that the Jewish question in Russia takes on this organizational dimension when you have Russian social democrats saying to the Jews, no, it's not legitimate for you to have a Jewish party or pursue any of these goals. I also want to mention that some non-Marxist groups did not object, non-Marxist socialist groups did not object to these syntheses, these combinations, these formations, these political ideological formations of Jewish nationalism and socialism. The example I have in mind is the Party of Socialist Revolutionaries, a very large non-Marxist party that was friendly to actually had a kind of formal alliance with the Jewish Socialist Workers' Party, this party that wanted full autonomy for Jews in a democratic Russia. Okay, so this is, as I say, a kind of, there's a Jewish question there in the Russian Empire is taking on these multiple forms. It's a debate about the future of Jews, the right of Jews to have their own political organizations, how to deal with the pogroms and other kinds of anti-Semitism that is really taking on serious, grave dimensions during this era, where Jews should live, should they emigrate, all kinds of debates were happening during this time. And then finally, there's the United States. The United States sees, actually even before Russia, the United States, and especially the big cities like New York and Chicago, sees the emergence of a large industrial working class quickly and earlier than anywhere else in Europe. Already in the 1880s, due to large-scale immigration from Russia, a working class forms in places like New York. And not only that, a Jewish workers' movement forms in these cities. Already by the mid-1880s, there's something that people call the Jewish Labour Movement in New York. The dimensions of this movement just grow as immigration grows. Most of these immigrant Jews, by the way, work in the clothing industry. Not exclusively, but heavily. The largest number of Jewish workers in the United States are based in the manufacture of ready-to-wear clothes or related products in the garment industry. Between the 1880s and let's say World War I, New York is home to well over 1 million Jews. there's no larger Jewish population in any city in the world, and the Jewish labor movement is also the largest in the world on the eve of World War I. It's a truly mass movement that consists of work of trade unions and cultural societies and newspapers and schools and political groups. Now, I don't want to go too much longer before questions, but I want to end by talking about um, uh, uh, one really big difference. There are a lot of differences between the United States and Russia at the time, but one very big difference is that there is no debate on the Jewish question between Jews in the larger party to which most Jewish radicals belong to, which is the Socialist Party. And this is because the Socialist Party, starting in 1906, allows immigrant groups, foreign-speaking immigrant groups, to form their own subsections or federations in the Socialist Party. The Finnish immigrants are the first to do it in 1906. Jews follow suit in 1912, and there's no controversy whatsoever. There's no debate here of the kind you see between, let's say, Lenin and the Bund. It's just not an issue. In a multicultural, multi-ethnic country like the United States, well, Russia is too, but American socialists, for one reason or another, perhaps because it's not a strictly Marxist party, perhaps because the party understands that immigrants are really necessary for the growth of the party, whatever the reason, it welcomes early on the formation of foreign language federations within the Socialist Party, and Jews take up that right, that option. And there is a Yiddish-speaking section of the Socialist Party. Now, here's the interesting thing. While there's no debate on this between Jews and the Socialist Party, unlike between Jews in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, there is an internal debate in the Jewish community over this question of whether Jews should form their own federation. The debate exists between, and this is going to link us back to Russia, the debate exists between the founders of the Jewish labor movement in the 1880s and 1890s and a younger generation, a later generation of immigrants who come from the Bund and some other parties, but especially the Bund. The older pioneers of the Jewish labor movement think, due to the influence of 19th century era Marxism and its assimilationism, and because of conviction that America is a melting pot that absorbs immigrants, these earlier, the early generation of Jewish socialists said, look, in America, Jews are going to assimilate. Therefore, Jews don't need their own section of the Socialist Party. And so this is almost un-American and un-Marxist at the same time to try and create a Yiddish-speaking section of the Socialist Party. It's, in other words, they're saying to the younger second generation, if you will, immigrants coming after 1905 who've gone through the revolution, who had been members of the Bund, they're saying to them, you can't recreate the Bund here. The Bund might be fine in Russia. It is great in Russia. We love the Bund, but we don't want a Bund in America. So there's a real friction. You could say the Jewish question plays out much more, with much more controversy in America within the Jewish labor movement than outside of it, or between the Jewish labor movement and the Socialist Party. The Bundists, you could say, kind of win this debate. That's another story. Let me wind this down, but I want to touch on later developments that I was asked to discuss, especially Zionism in the Zionist movement, eventually this creation of the State of Israel. We can save that to discussion. But I want to say that after World War I, there are a couple of major developments that have to be taken into account in trying to understand comprehensively the relationship of Jews to socialism. The first is, of course, the Russian Revolution, the rise of the Soviet government, rise of the Soviet Union, and the coming to power of the Bolshevik Party changed things in an interesting way. First, the Bolsheviks basically, or in a lot of ways, reversed themselves. The Bolsheviks identify Jews as a nationality. They implement a form of national cultural autonomy. because they're ruling over a large Jewish population that speaks Yiddish that they have to deal with in some way. Not only that, but in the 1920s, the Soviet Union sets up a number of agricultural communes for Jews. That's an interesting story in and of itself, but I want to mention that here because that was nowhere in the pre-1917 Bolshevik program, the settlement of Jews in agricultural colonies. So the Soviet Union recognizes Jews as a kind of nationality without a territory. It uses Yiddish in an official capacity and creates these agricultural communes. So the Soviet government moves for a while in the 20s into the 30s in a different direction than the Bolsheviks had gone before. Second, you have the growth of the Jewish national home in Palestine after World War I, although this had begun before World War I. And one thing that's important here is that the socialist Zionists become hegemonic in the Zionist movement, especially in the Yishuv, which is to say the Jewish community of Palestine, where the socialists really become the architects of what will become the state of Israel. So that's another important development. All these different movements from the Bund to Zionists and all that are in the United States as well. And in the United States, socialist Zionists become much more prominent after World War I than they do before World War I. So there are some important changes internationally due to the rise of, again, the Soviet government in Russia, the growth of the Jewish community in Palestine, and then beyond that, of course, the rise of Nazi Germany in World War II will be a final chapter, if you will, in this era. So I'll wind it down here and turn to questions and discussion.
Hello? Can people hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
So very good talk. So I had some theoretical questions.
Mm-hmm.
One is, isn't it interesting the different trajectory of Yiddish-speaking Jews in the Russian Empire and say Ladino-speaking Jews in the Ottoman? Sort of what accounts for that difference with the and to what it?
Yeah,
well, and so I was going to ask another question. Two questions related to that. One is, you mentioned tale of settlement.
Wait, I'm sorry.
And isn't it also the case that Jewish working class was large?
I can't hear whoever's talking.
Hello? Can people hear me?
No, you're cutting in and out. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm going to try to get to a place. So I was asking about the different trajectory of Yiddish-speaking Jews in the Russian Empire versus Ladino-speaking Jews, the development of this whole Yiddish literature, whole Yiddish secular culture, a socialist culture, etc., whereas you had a Jewish land. And the other question I had was, you mentioned about the Pale of Settlement and the Jewish socialist movement in Russia and the United States. Now, isn't it the case that most of the Jewish working class was being employed by Jewish capitalists? Right? So in that sense, the class struggle in the Jewish community was an intra-Jewish struggle.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And my third theoretical question is, what do you think about the Abraham-Leon thesis of the people class, like as an explanatory explanation of,
I think the one major exception regarding Ladino-speaking Jews that should be mentioned were the Jews of Salonika. Jews of Salonika are an interesting case and probably should be, I would say, I would like to see a systematic comparison between the Jewish working class of New York and the Jewish working class of Salonika. In Salonika, first of all, Jews, I believe, are about 50% of the overall population. So they're quite important in terms of size. They're also there's a very strong working class there and an organized working class, which is to say there's a Jewish labor movement in Salonika among Ladino-speaking Jews. These are Ladino-speaking Sephardic Jews. So there is an important instance in which Jews emerge again as a distinct, organized working class, occupying a very important part of this, the economy, which is another way of saying, unlike in the Pale of Settlement, where Jews in a lot of ways are marginal, economically marginal in the Pale of Settlement, they are not in Salonika. And so I think actually I would say a three-way comparison I would like to see. Let's say the Jews of Warsaw. It would be interesting to see a comparison of the Jews of Warsaw, let's say, and Salonika and New York City to try and get a handle on the similarities and differences between the development, the class development, and the political development of Jewish workers in those places. Second, in a lot of ways, we are talking about an internal Jewish struggle. A lot of the employers in the Pale Settlement, certainly in New York City, were other Jews. I can speak more to New York, but most of the clothing manufacturers and the subcontractors that dominated the production of clothing in New York were Jews. First, older Jewish immigrants that had come over from Germany. Later, other Eastern European Jews, many of whom started off as workers and became either contractors or manufacturers themselves. So this is right. Your observation is correct. That to a large degree that we're talking about Jewish workers against Jewish bosses. I want to say I want to make a comment about what might be significant in that, but I also want to mention a caveat. The caveat is, the people I've just defined as bosses or employers were they were fairly small scale in a lot of instances. So a lot of those contractors, manufacturers, as I mentioned, were workers who had worked their way up. But when they were employers, their sweatshops are pretty small. So, a sweatshop could employ, 15, 20, 30 people. We're not talking in many instances of huge factories. So these bosses, sometimes let me put it in quotes, bosses, were often very precarious. Jewish clothing manufacturers and contractors went in and out of business a lot. And for that matter, those who were employers sometimes slid back and forth between between the working class and the owning class because their existence was precarious. And then sometimes you had bosses who played two roles at once. They ran a sweatshop, but they were also operating a sewing machine with other workers. So the Jewish working class, even in New York City, which is a much more vibrant, dynamic, had a much more vibrant, dynamic economy than many places in Russia, still, when you hear terms like a Jewish working class or proletariat, just keep in mind that we're not talking about an automotive plant. We're not talking about a coal mine. Huge concerns that are capital intensive, engaged in heavy or primary industries.
May I ask a question about that?
Yes.
I mean, so there were some very among the largest industrial concerns in the world in Russia, in Tsarist Russia. I'm assuming that the working class in Petersburg and Moscow and Kryvyi Rih were actually almost entirely ethnically Russian and not Jewish or Ukrainian or anything else.
I do think there's Ukrainian immigration there, but I can't speak to that. But I think the more important point for us is that it's not Jewish. That's the key point. Yes, those big industrial concerns in Russia proper were not, or Great Russia, they were not Jewish. So let's say the Jewish working class in Jewish workers, let's say in Minsk or Lodge or something, the factories they worked in made consumer items, like cigarettes, for instance, So yeah, you find cigarette factories that Jews are employed in, sometimes with non-Jews, but only, this is all limited. There were also Jewish workers in smaller workshops. And in the 1890s, when the Bund was created, they went on strike. These workers went on strike a lot, as part of their radicalization. But they often, even when they won those strikes, the strikes often didn't amount to much. There was one Jewish radical of the time who said a Jewish strike is a strike of paupers against beggars. You understand the point he's trying to make. We're talking about poor people striking against people who are maybe slightly less poor. So when the Bund spoke about the Jewish proletariat, there could be a fair amount of exaggeration or a transposition of Marxist terminology on a working class that wasn't that was different from the Russian proletariat and increasingly employed again in these big industrial concerns. And that goes right back to the conflict between the Socialist Zionists and the Bundists. The Socialist Zionists, again, were saying, what are you talking about, a Jewish proletariat? Yeah, some are working in factories, but many aren't. What you're calling a proletariat, we're calling people who are barely hanging on by their fingernails.
May I ask you another question about that? What about the cultural question? I mean, was there a cultural difference in terms of the background of the Jewish workers? I know that a lot of the early Bundists were yeshiva students. So, were the people who were becoming radicalized? Like, what was the effect of, let's say, the cultural baggage of several thousand years of Jewish history in terms of Jewish socialism?
Yeah. All right. So there's several different elements when we're talking about the early Bund. You have the intellectuals, what are called the intellectuals. The intellectuals early on are often people who speak Russian, not Yiddish. They're young people, in their 20s. And they speak Russian because of Yiddish instead of Yiddish because they were raised in Russified families. Their parents wanted to give their kids some Russian education, maybe no Jewish education or very little. They went to universities, obviously Russian-speaking universities, and were fairly acculturated, if not totally assimilated. The distinction I'll draw between acculturated and assimilated is that a good number of these people spoke Russian, read Russian literature, received good Russian educations, but they were not absorbed socially into the non-Jewish population. Some of them joined revolutionary groups because this was hospitable to them. In Russia, there were almost no social realms in which being Jewish didn't matter. It almost always mattered, and it was never an advantage. There was almost nothing that the historian Jacob Katz called a neutral society. There were almost no spheres in Russia that were neutral, in which people from all backgrounds could come together on the basis of some shared identity. The Socialist Movement was one of those places. And it was very hospitable, you could say, to Jews who, again, they don't see themselves as belonging to the Jewish people, but they don't see themselves as Russian either. Or maybe this, they see themselves as Russian, they aspire to be Russian, but Russian society doesn't let them in. So they're blocked. Now, people from that kind of sociological background, you could find among the founders of the Bund. All right. So Russian-speaking intellectuals are among those founders of the Bund. Second, you mentioned ex-yeshiva students. That was indeed an element of the early Bund. They were sometimes referred to as half intellectuals. What that meant is that these were people who were training to become rabbis. Rabbis, and of course, in Jewish society, traditionally, rabbis are the most prestigious people in the Jewish community. Not because they have money, they might be very poor. But in traditional Jewish society, Jewish education is what matters most in rabbis, and being learned, meaning to be scholars in the Talmud and Jewish tradition. Okay, so what you see by the 1890s is a small but growing number of yeshiva students, rabbinical students, who are breaking away and moving outward to towards the new ideologies and movements that are coming up. Some of them go to Zionism. Some of them go to Socialist Zionism. Some of them go to Marxism of one kind or another. Some go to the Bund. And they play a very important role because they become sort of, in the early years, they're kind of mid-level activists. The intellectuals are at the top. These ex-yeshiva students are kind of in the middle. And then you have the workers. The workers come indeed from the lowest economic level of the Jewish community. Not that the Jewish community is especially stratified in terms of class. The Jewish community is actually generally not very stratified. It's mostly compressed into a few different occupations. But that's even starting to change a little bit with the growth of industrialization. You do get some very wealthy Jews that make money in, let's say, railroads, the development of the railroads. All right. But generally what we're talking about here is traders, small businessmen, craftsmen, artisans, wage workers. And the wage workers are coming from the bottom. Or they're artisans who are falling down. This is very important for understanding the growth of the socialist movement. A lot of the socialist activists are declining. They're artisans who are, again, seeing that they can't make a living anymore making shoes or sewing pants or something. They can't do it anymore because they can't compete with factories. Now, a lot of those people leave. They go to the United States. They go to Argentina. They go to England. They leave because they can't make a living. And among those people who stay and eventually leave are people who are attracted to the Jewish workers' movement, the Bund, and other parties. So that's to give you a kind of thumbnail sketch and answer to your question about who's being drawn into the Bund. Through at least three different elements of the Jewish community. The Russian-speaking, university-educated revolutionaries who come back, if you will, to the Jewish proletariat and join forces. Then you've got these ex-yeshiva students who become radicalized while they're studying to be rabbis, and then a number of them get drawn into the Bund as they would to any number of parties. And then you've got the mass, thousands of people who are becoming radicalized as workers of some sort. I might have gotten lost now in all your questions.
I asked you about the Abraham Leon thesis about the people class.
So
what do you think of that understanding of Jewish history?
Richard, could you just explain what the Abraham Leon, what you were referring to?
Abraham Leon was a Marxist, a Trotskyist who died in Auschwitz, in fact. And he has a classic book on Marxism, the Jewish question, and he explains the survival of the Jews as a kind of people class, right? And it's a controversial thesis. I was wondering what Professor Michels thought of that thesis as analytically.
I have to be honest, I have to really sit down with it and seriously study it in a way I never have. I've looked at the introduction before, I've looked at other parts, but I haven't seriously studied it. I'd say just my initial thought is that it does deserve serious attention. In fact, I would make a larger point here that I would say that Marxist approaches to the study of Jewish history are undeveloped. It started to spring up prior to World War II in the Soviet Union, in Poland, and in Jerusalem, where you see, or later Tel Aviv University, where you see in those places various kinds of Marxists, either communists or Marxist-Zionists, starting to study Jewish history in light of, a historical materialist Marxist perspective. None of it, that kind of got cut off by the Holocaust. And so I think I think there should be a return to those works to see what the potential is. And I would include Leon in that. I think Leon, my impression, this is only a impression, is that he's onto something here. He's onto something, but I think there might be a risk in overemphasizing that paradigm. Let me put it this way. I believe there are parts of Jewish tradition that he doesn't account for, but has to be seen as at least semi-autonomous factors in the development of Jewish history. And that is, let's call it what he calls it, the idealistic the idealistic dimension to Jewish life. I mean, I think there are factors like messianism that have to be understood as having their own inner history. Now, surely I would never say, let's say, that we should study messianic movements in Jewish life divorced from what is happening materially. I would never say that. But what I'd also say is that this seems to be a tradition, messianism, messianic thought, that has to be understood in terms of its own internal tradition, not just something ephemeral or superstructural or something like that. So I think, that's the only thing I would feel comfortable saying. Two things. One, I think Leon should be taken seriously. Two, that doesn't mean treating him uncritically. And three, if I have any skepticism at this point, it's that he doesn't see, it seems to me, he does not see or is willing to give very little weight to the internal cultural, intellectual, religious dimensions to Jewish life, which can't be reduced, in my opinion, to a materialistic analysis.
I have one more question, and then I'll let other people ask.
Sorry, Richard.
Okay.
I think we might. You can ask it later though, for sure. Just for now, we can move to like in person because I'd like to alternate between people ask questions, and I think I'll be the first person to ask you, Professor Michels. Just after listening to your teaching, I'm just wondering, to return to the last question of the prompt, what is the meaning of this history in the present? What is the meaning of this history today? Because when I look around, the history you described, it seems very anachronistic, like the Jewish Bund and the Pale of the Settlement and this whole question of assimilation. Of course, anti-Semitism seems to be a problem, but it seems to be a totally different world. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts how to draw a connection. And I guess just to like supplement that, I read you published an article in Jacobin in 2016 on Bernie Sanders. If I can remember the title, Bernie Sanders and the History of American Socialism, where you propose that Bernie Sanders has like some roots, perhaps, like New York Yiddish radicalism, Yiddish socialism. But besides that, I've personally noticed that there has been like, especially after the October 7th attacks, there's been a revival of interest on the left on Jewish anti-Zionism. For instance, at UChicago, the UChicago Jews for a Free Palestine, they hosted a teach-in on histories of Jewish anti-Zionism. So basically, I just put that, perhaps you can respond to what is the meaning of this history, and also what do you make of returning to this history in the present?
Okay, it's a great question. Okay, I have a few thoughts about the relevance of this history to the present day. First, let me start with what's changed. As you noted, a lot has changed. The biggest change was the Holocaust. It might seem obvious, but it needs to be stressed that the annihilation of most Jews in the world, in Europe, and especially in Europe, but not only Europe, also in the former Ottoman Empire, changed everything. So as far as for our subject goes, the Jewish working class of Poland, there were over 3 million Jews in Poland at the time, as of 1939. So that population was killed. The Bund, for instance, because of this, the Bund was reduced to being a negligible factor. The social base of the Bund was murdered. So the Bund didn't disappear overnight, but it is a really serious factor in Jewish life in Eastern Europe. But you could also say, by extension, most countries around the world, with, let's say, the exception of Melbourne, Australia, where the Bund survives to this day. The Holocaust just changed all that. So that's a big factor. Most of the Jews were killed. Most of the Jewish working class was killed. The party in Poland the largest party, identified with the Jewish working class. The Bund was rendered almost obsolete. You could also argue that the Soviet Union, that's a very complicated history of Jews in the Soviet Union, so I'm not going to get into that, but you could argue as well that this was another major change. The integration, the eventual forced assimilation, anti-Semitism as a state policy, these things, and then eventually the immigration of most former Soviet Jews also affected the demographics and character of the Jews globally. In the United States, to come closer to home, after World War II, you could already see you see a movement of Jews into. Actually, sorry. Let me step back to describe the change that Desmond was referring to that makes this history on certain levels seem so remote. Let me step back to the end of mass immigration to the United States in the 1920s, the passing of severe immigration restriction laws in Congress that weren't directed only towards Jews, but towards Europeans, especially people from Eastern and Southern Europe, had a really strong effect on Jews in the United States. It meant that there were not poor Jews coming over by the hundreds of thousands anymore, feeding into this Jewish working class that I briefly described already. So the cutting off of immigration had a big effect. Second, the American economy, especially after the Depression, proved absorptive enough to bring what had been a predominantly Jewish working class, or predominantly working class Jewish community into the middle class, or certain segments of the middle class. This started already by the 1920s. It was arrested by the Great Depression, and it was revived or renewed. Upward mobility was renewed after World War II, when the American economy went into a long period of expansion. So there was a twofold process here. The end of immigration, meaning the end of large numbers of poor Jews coming to the United States in huge numbers. It wasn't a total cessation, but the end of a large number of Jews played into this. The return of the restoration of restabilization of capitalism in a period of unprecedented growth after World War II. Third, a decline in anti-Semitism in the United States after World War II, and in part in connection with World War II, meaning an increase in sympathy for Jews as part of the anti-Nazi crusade, a feeling in the United States that anti-Semitism was un-American by the 1940s and 1950s. This was a widespread view in the United States that, if hating Jews was what Nazis did, Nazism was the enemy. So to hate Jews is to be un-American. That was a really widespread feeling by the 1950s. Anti-Semitism is not to say that anti-Semitism came down overnight. It didn't. But by the 1960s, there was a very strong decline of anti-Semitism. It never went away. White supremacy as an organized movement continued to exist. White supremacists continued to hate Jews and violently attack them all through the end of the 20th century into the present day. Simply to say that compared to the 1930s, anti-Semitism was much milder, and all sorts of discrimination against Jews in education, in housing, in employment was made illegal nationally in the 1960s. So for a host of factors, Jews were integrated into the middle classes and professional classes, and even sometimes higher. And then I've already mentioned the Holocaust is a factor. So the world changed dramatically. And of course, there's the rise of the State of Israel. Now, in the rise of the State of Israel, you do see in Israel to the present day, there's still a Jewish working class. If you were to identify a sizable Jewish working class, it's Israel. So the Jewish working class never declined in Israel. And of course, for Israel's first, let's say, 30 years, socialists of various kinds dominated Israeli institutions. So socialism continued there in a very different context than the United States or Poland or Tsarist Russia. That's a subject in and of itself. But again, there in Israel, you see the continuation of a working class that had gained power, if you will, through the creation of a Jewish state. And of course, culturally or linguistically, the language is not Yiddish officially; it's Hebrew. So that's its own trajectory in the following decades of again talking about Jewish working class. Okay, now. Desmond, I haven't forgotten your question about the relevance. I was simply trying to elaborate on your point about how much has changed. And again, several things changed after World War II. I tried to outline those, including, so on the one extreme, the destruction of European Jewry and a good deal of Sephardic Jewry, and then the rise of a Jewish nation state. And then thirdly, the incorporation to a fairly large degree of Jews into American society and the American economy in a time when the American economy was very robust. Three different trajectories in the mid-20th century: destruction, the Holocaust, the rise of a nation state, and the success or seeming success of the liberal paradigm. The Jews as citizens, gaining their rights as citizens, and being treated more or less equally in American society. All right. What makes this relevant, however, I would say are a few things. One is a return of anti-Semitism in this country and a number of others on a scale that no one predicted, let's say, in the 1990s. I say the 1990s because I see the 1990s as marking more or less the end of what I would call the post-war era, or the post-war, and more specifically, the post-war golden age for Jews, of the sort I just tried to describe, in which anti-Semitism diminished and Jews became integrated in various ways. That was an era of good feeling towards Jews, in which many Jews at the time thought, this is great. This is, to be a Jew in America in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s was to be fully accepted, and to live with a sense of unprecedented security. Jews were free to be Jews, and this was great. All right. I think that era comes to an end in the early 2000s. I think this becomes more vivid with the election of Trump in 2016. And I think now in the current period, the level of anti-Semitism is shocking. So there is the Jewish question. In other words, there is a Jewish question again. A Jewish question here is defined by the place of Jews in American society, in American institutions, in American policy, foreign policy. All these things, I would say, are aspects of, or realms in which there is a Jewish question, interlaced with or coupled with a resurgence of hostility towards Jews. That hostility, in part, has a traditional source. That is to say, the far right, the white supremacist right wing, which of course enjoyed, it seems to enjoyed a revival in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump. I believe the election of Trump has a strong economic development foundation to it. We can talk about and speculate about the relationship of shifts in the economy, in the class structure, and the rise of that white nationalist right. But let's just say it's resurged, it's surged, it's brought with it anti-Semitism that has existed deeply for a long period of time, and that anti-Semitism has shown that it can take murderous forms. All right. Related to that, I would say what is an important aspect of the return of the Jewish question is the diminishment of liberal values and institutions. the guardrails that had previously protected, let's say, the liberal center, and that can include moderate Republicans, liberal to moderate Democrats, and so on. The various safeguards and values that existed prior, so that white supremacists seem to be marginal, I would say have eroded. That's another important factor in understanding the seriousness, what I take to be the seriousness of the Jewish question or anti-Semitism. All right. So that's on those are traditional sources. I'm saying there are traditional sources of anti-Semitism that have reached, in my opinion, dangerous dimensions because of two factors. I think the marginalization economically of large portions of the population, coupled with an erosion of democratic values and institutions. And then in what here I would say what is, quote, new, let me qualify this in a moment, but a newer source of anti-Semitism, which purportedly comes from the left, and is related to, well, let's say the main carrier of which, the bearer of this anti-Semitism, it comes in the movement to strip Jews of their rights in Israel, meaning to say that the Jews as a nation should be eliminated, that the right to self-determination should somehow be destroyed. That movement, and I describe it in those terms, I think it's best understood in those terms. In other words, that movement is become a vehicle of anti-Semitism. So you have two now anti-Semitism coming from the right and the left in a way that was never true prior to World War II. Actually, I'd say prior to 1967. You would never hear the way Jews are talked about on the left. And this is in part because anti-Zionism prior to 1948 meant something quite different than it did after 67, and certainly after October 7th. So this is then, we've got a return of the Jewish question. Again, going back to Desmond's question of what's relevant here. We have a return of a Jewish question, a return of anti-Semitism that cries out for an analysis. And I think Marxism could play an important role in developing a sophisticated, multi-tiered understanding of why all this is happening. I would, Moshe Postone's writings, I think, would be an important place, if not to start, then to draw on. He talks about, for instance, the way in which, since at least the 70s, left-wing movements come to support what would otherwise be seen as right-wing movements abroad. So he cites the example of the Iranian Revolution of 1979. This is a shift. This is a really important development that differentiates the post-70s left, or if you want to go a little further back, the post-67 left from the pre-World War II left. So we have an anti-Semitism problem again. And I think we're only just beginning to try and figure that out. Those, I would say, again, in answer to Desmond's question, that's one way I'd say this is quite, the old debates are relevant. A lot has changed, but certain things have not changed or have returned in new form or modified form. And I think it's worth reading a lot of those old socialist debates, Marxist and non-Marxist debates about the Jewish question. I read a lot of them, and it's a foundation. And one thing I've learned in my own research is that we have a certain kind of luxury of not having to be partisan. That we don't have to say the Bund is right. No, Proletarian's right. No, the Bolsheviks were right. I mean, I look back on all those old debates and I say, well, this party or this person is addressing this particular problem or identifying a problem in ways that are more convincing than another party or group. I mean, we have, in other words, the advantage or the privilege of retrospection, the retrospection that allows us to go back and learn, so what's living and what might not be living, but what's maybe living in ways that can inform our own understanding. And I'm sorry, let me just say one thing. This is maybe a pithier way of trying to say what I was saying before. What I guess I was saying is all the various solutions put forward to solve the Jewish problems prior to World War II. Those debates are still with us because there was a debate over whether Jews needed a homeland back then, and there's a debate now whether Jews should continue to have a homeland. And again, in that sense, the old debates, although they seem to have been settled in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, they have come back. And just as a little footnote, there are some Jews who reclaim the legacy of the Bund, rightly or wrongly. They see the Bund as their inspiration and forebears and predecessors. So even that name is used by some Jewish activists today who are looking for lineage and see it in the Bund. So that's my answer, at least part of an answer.
Thank you, Tony. Next, I think, Ben, you can ask your question.
Getting dark.
Actually, one of the questions I had was going to be about if Moishe Postone had influenced your thinking, so you answered that question.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to also ask a little bit more about, like, since you're writing a book about the Jews and including like the Jewish socialist movement in Russia in that time period,
Mm-hmm.
how would you like situate the history of like Jews in Russia and in Europe and in America in like earlier and sort of more broad debates about like Jewish history or historiography?
Mm-hmm.
Because you also mentioned someone like Jacob Katz,
Mm-hmm.
who's like a more general historian of anti-Semitism and has a particular point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Something about things like the the Leidensgeschichte, the like suffering history, as like a paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like other historians who are getting like a resurgence of popularity. People like Albert Lindemann, who has
Mm-hmm.
criticized like Jacob Katz and like Leidensgeschichte in general. And so I
Mm-hmm.
guess like where do you think the significance of that debate lies in, and how would you put like Jewish socialist historiography and like the trials over anti-Semitism and socialism and Zionism and that, or where do you fall on that?
That's great. Ben, can I ask you, are you studying Jewish history?
No, I've read a lot about it.
Clearly, you've read a lot about it. Okay, that's impressive. Why did you mention Albert Lindemann? If I'm going to tell you why I'm asking in a second.
He's become, I think, growing in popularity. I've found him just from discussions of him and like the context of discussions of anti-Semitism on just on the internet, I think on social media. And I know he's like controversial and has a particular point of view.
Right.
But he, in his like introduction to his book, he deals with this issue of like historiography more generally.
Who's he becoming popular? You say he's becoming popular. Who do you who's he becoming popular among from what you can tell?
I see just like young people in general mentioning it.
I asked for a couple reasons. One, I took a course with him when I was in college. He co-taught a course on the history of anti-Semitism. And I read one of his books in manuscript form. It was assigned as a kind of a textbook for that class.
This is Esau's Tears.
Well, I don't know if it became Esau's Tears or something else. He has another book, I think, on like certain anti-Semitic incidents. But I, as I'm talking, I think it became Esau's Tears. So Lindemann. let me put it this way. So the thing that stood out for me in that book, or wasn't a book yet, was that Lindemann was saying, or at least provoking us, encouraging us, not provoking, encouraging us to think about the connection between hatred of Jews or dislike of Jews. First of all, I guess to question what is hatred of Jews and what is a reasonable critique. And that was based on, I think, a point he's making, and that is that there were non-Jews who looked at the changing reality of Europe. He studied Europe, saw changes that were problematic, economic depressions, let's say. And did not, let me put it this way, did not unreasonably conclude, according to Lindemann, that Jews were bound up with negative developments in society. This is what I remember an important part of his argument being. At the time, again, I was just a long time ago. I was 19 years old. I thought it was a thought-provoking viewpoint. But there, people have been concerned that Lindemann himself was an anti-Semite. And in fact, I'll tell you, a colleague of his said it to me that bluntly. I won't name the colleague. It's not important. But I can say that it was one colleague who said it to me, and a second colleague at a different university agreed. Let me just say he agreed.
People were saying that on HistoryNet for quite a while.
Okay, all right. So those two aren't the only ones. I have not seen Lindemann's work since then. I guess what I'm saying here is that Lindemann, in my opinion, should be treated carefully. What else? Okay, you mentioned Leidensgeschichte, kind of this view of Jews as suffering history. I don't think there's anyone, very few Jewish historians who adopt that view today. In fact, most historians have gone in the opposite direction in the recent decades to trying to avoid looking at Jewish history in terms of suffering, violence, anti-Semitism, and so on. This is especially true in the American Jewish field, where for a long time, American Jewish historians almost never paid any attention to anti-Semitism. Very rarely did they pay attention to it. And the emphasis was on, it was sort of a liberal interpretation of American Jewish history that went something like this. Jews came to the United States, they struggled, they dealt with discrimination, they dealt with poverty. They eventually, however, overcame it because America became a more tolerant place. And as it was bound to do, because America is fundamentally a liberal democratic country. This was, in superficial, sort of in broad strokes, in stating this somewhat superficially, this was the overall outlook in the American Jewish field. It was almost teleological, that it was all, these works are written in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. And from that vantage point, it seemed all but inevitable that American Jews were going to travel this road to success. So this was an anti-Leidensgeschichte approach. This was quite the opposite. I don't recommend that approach. I am sympathetic. I think Jewish historians need to find some new approach, maybe some new synthesis. And I'm not sure it's in the works or not, is in the field. I know I can only speak for myself. I'm trying to do this. So here's roughly some part of my view. One, I agree with Jonathan Frankel, the great Russian Jewish historian, who wrote a very important tome called Prophecy and Politics, Socialism, Nationalism, and the Russian Jews, 1862 to 1917. Absolutely crucial book for what we're talking about this evening. Some people have described his conceptualization of Russian Jewish politics in that book as a crisis paradigm, meaning that he looks at crises, pogroms, revolution, war, as central engines in the development of American Jewish politics. I am very sympathetic to that view, even though there are a lot of critics of that view. In other words, I think much of modern Jewish history can be, and especially politics, can be explained through crises. Or to put it even differently, crises are a useful way of looking at larger changes that are visible and changes that are substructural, that become visible in moments of conflict. Again, war, pogroms, anti-Jewish, right? Whatever the case is. So I think a properly subtle view of crisis, is for me very useful in understanding the development of modern Jewish history. It doesn't explain everything. Don't get me wrong. I would never say that. I'm saying that I find it very useful in explaining key developments in politics, but not only politics. So that's one thing I would take into consideration. Second, the persistence of anti-Semitism, I think, must be accounted for without sliding back into a kind of suffering history model. All right. And certainly not a teleological view that all of modern Jewish history is headed to the Holocaust. That's not what I'm trying to suggest. What I'm saying is that its staying power suggests that it has to be incorporated and not is treated as something that's either an aberration, an exception, or something relegated to the past, somehow pre-modern. I don't have the answers for how it should be studied. I'm just convinced it needs to be studied. Third, and I suggested this in my comments on Abram Leon, I believe Jewish history needs to incorporate an attention to class, really in a serious way. I don't know how to do it, but I'm convinced it needs to be done. So I'm suggesting three, I guess, lenses that I would like to see integrated into an overall whole. Anti-Semitism, crisis, and class. Right? This is what I'd like to see. This is where my thinking is right now. Again, there's more to be said. I don't have a fully worked out theory or analytical, comprehensive analytical approach. But I would like to see those things. It's another way of saying that the dark side of modern history should be incorporated in and combined with the other side, which is the incredible, at times and places, integration of Jews into the larger society that would help us, for instance, account for the rise of Hollywood. That's an incredible way in which Jews really helped shape the culture of American life. I'm not saying we ignore these things. I think we have to look at contradiction, contrast, polarization, zigzags in history. These are the things that I would like to see. This is the elements I'd like to see in a new paradigm.
Can I follow up? I have a question about, like, when we're talking about the older history, do you think that people, I often had the feeling, like reading Ben-Gurion's biography, in a slightly different world, Ben-Gurion could have become a Bolshevik or vice versa. And so I have the feeling that, like, these people who vigorously disagreed with politics, that nevertheless there were certain aspects of their Weltanschauung that they shared, and they took different directions.
Yes.
Whereas we are living in a completely different world from all of these people.
Well, in a lot of ways, yes and yes. Meaning, there is actually, I recommend, if you haven't read it, there's been some good work by the historian Anita Shapira and others about just your point about, you can see some of them. Well, Ben-Gurion was very sympathetic to Bolshevism in the 1920s. And Anita Shapira has written about this.
He really admired Lenin. I'm not sure if that was sympathy with Bolshevism, but he admired Lenin personally.
Yeah, but I think once the Bolsheviks were in power, he admired their efforts to transform what was a devastated country that had been suffocated under the Tsar for so long. So anyway, it's worth seeking out the one or two scholars that I know of who have written about that, about the sympathy among socialist Zionists for Bolshevism in the 20s, and in some cases beyond. There's also a very entertaining and enjoyable essay that came out in the late 80s called Trotsky in Israel, I think was the name of it. And it set up this kind of counterfactual history. What would Trotsky have done had he survived the assassination attempt in Mexico City? And it sets up this plausible scenario in which Trotsky winds up moving to Israel, not because he becomes a Zionist. It's because Mexico kicks him out and the U.S. doesn't let him in. So he goes to Israel under the law of return. And then the question taken up in the essay is, well, where does Trotsky go politically? You know, obviously he's not going to go with the Communist Party, or he's not going to go with the United Workers' Party or MAPAM, which is a pro-Soviet Marxist Zionist party because it's pro-Soviet. So where does a guy like Trotsky go? Well, he kind of admires Ben-Gurion, who can admire him. And it goes on like that. If you can ever find it, it ran in the Partisan Review in the 1980s. That was one thing. Was that it? Was that your
Yeah, it was a question about the psychology of these people,
yeah,
like, and how they chose the different ideologies, but feeling that all of these ideologies had something in common with each other.
Well, they were
even though they were bitterly opposed.
Yes, well,
and often murderous.
They were formed in the Russian Empire. You know, they were formed in the Russian Empire, so that helps explain in the Russian revolutionary milieu. I mean, Ben-Gurion and his early comrades, you know, for them, the 1905 revolution was a formative experience. You know, they lived through it. Some of them fought in it. They were at the barricades. So you know, that is part of their development, of course. And they were trying to forge very different realities. You know, the Bolsheviks in Russia, the Socialist Zionists in Palestine. You know, they're really trying to take control of reality and transform it in just major ways. The world's changed a lot, for sure. It's hard, for instance, I would say, you know, the optimism of the pre-World War I period is hard to relate to today.
Tony, I realize actually we have a question in the chat. I should have read out at the beginning since it was asked much earlier. And the question is from Thomas Prieto, who asks, what was the background that led to August Bebel's famous statement that anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools? And what did he mean by that?
As far as I know, and I'm not an expert on Bebel, as far as I know, this is in the 1890s. He makes that comment. And I believe it was in response to the phenomenon in which there was an unfortunate phenomenon among some socialists in Central Europe to share in the anti-Jewish view that Jews were a kind of exploiting subgroup, or maybe the main exploiting element in the bourgeoisie. This is a problem in the 19th century. There are various people, social democrats, but also anarchists, who view Jews as exploiters. There were different views about this. Sometimes the view was simply, you know, no, they aren't the major exploiters, but when the working class or the peasantry, as the case may be, starts to hate Jews, this is the beginning of a political consciousness. And so if they hate Jews, eventually they're going to mature, and they're going to see that the Jews, you know, that the bourgeoisie or the landowning class, the nobility or the czar or whoever are the problem. So again, hating Jews is a step forward. Others were more anti-Semitic in their views. They saw Jews as kind of symbols of, you know, particularly bad case, for a particularly bad manifestation of capitalism. And so So Babel was saying, anti-Semitism, meaning hating Jews because you think they're the exploiters, they're the bloodsuckers or whatever, is an idiotic form of anti-capitalism. And one thing that's noticeable is that attitude hasn't gone away, even in the present. So Marxism properly understood leaves no room for this. This is something that's important to mention. Even if Marxists themselves didn't have the most sophisticated understanding of anti-Semitism, especially prior to World War I, there was nothing in Marxism at all that said, you should hate Jews. Quite the contrary. It draws one thing I think that's important about Marxism in this era is that it puts forward an analysis of society that doesn't leave any room for, it's no room within the theoretical model for hating Jews. It makes no sense to hate Jews within Marxism. In that sense, Marxism is, if not anti-Semitic, then at least indirectly anti-Semitic, even if it doesn't directly address it, the problem. It's saying to workers, your problems don't rest with the Jews. The Jews aren't the source of your problems. Now, what Babel again was addressing were socialists who didn't adequately appreciate that. They didn't adequately appreciate what Marx had to say about capitalism. And that's shown, and again, in their dislike of Jews.
Thanks, Tony. I think Ben Katz just asked a question, which I think in the chat, I'll read out for him. He asks, regarding Marxism and Judaism, what do you make of on the Jewish question, either by Marx, either in its intrinsic content or its relevance for reading the rest of Marx?
Well, I haven't read it in a while, but here's my view. My view is that half the essay is accepts the emancipation of Jews. In that sense, it's an opposition to anti-Semitism. It's saying that of course the Jews should have equal civil and political rights. That's the good part of the essay, as I see it. The problematic part of the essay is its anti-Jewish terminology to discuss the nature of capitalism. So what do I think about that? Calling Judaism a religion of huckstering and Jews hucksters and all that. I think, first of all, it's not only unfortunate, it is totally unnecessary as I see it. Because it seems to me that what Marx was saying is that, yes, you can emancipate Jews, but that only goes so far. Ultimately, humanity still has to be emancipated from capitalism. So we need to go beyond the bourgeois liberal state that emancipates and again, the granting of civil and political rights towards something deeper, more profound. There's no reason to make that argument. There's no reason to employ anti-Semitic terminology to make that argument. So it seems to me, first of all, it's not essential to the essay. I guess this is what I'm trying to say. I'm sorry to say two things about the essay. One is it's an argument, part of it's an argument in favor of emancipation. That puts him on the side of those who oppose anti-Semitism in the 1840s and in that time when the essay was written. Second, the second part of the essay about the limitations of emancipation in the bourgeois sense does not need to draw on anti-Semitic imagery. So it stands alone without it. Take out every negative reference to Jews, and nothing really changes in the essay at all. I don't think anything changes. So it's unnecessary, it's superfluous, it gets in the way. It's really unfortunate. And from what I understand, later socialists in the 19th century were so embarrassed by it that they actually didn't reprint it. That you could read collections of Marx's work and there's nothing, that essay is not in it. Now, what does it have? What are the ramifications for his overall body of work? I think there are some people who will disagree with me, but I don't think it has any bearing on it. In other words, later as time goes by, maybe you see once every so often some traces of some traces of Jews which suggest perhaps that, he views Jews as antiquated in some way, Jews as a people as antiquated. But it's my sense that it doesn't that the anti-Semitism that exists on the Jewish question does not tarnish the majority of his work and his most important works. That's how I see it. This again, not to say that he cared about Jews all that much, or it's not to say that he was a fighter against anti-Semitism. I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying that I don't see Marx in the bulk of his work as anti-Semitic, or tainted by that essay. One thing I'll recommend, if you haven't read it already, Shlomo Avineri, the late Israeli scholar and political theorist, not long before his death a few years ago, wrote a really terrific little biography of Marx in a series called Jewish Lives, published by Yale University Press. It's really excellent as a biography, and his discussion on the Jewish question is important. It's a very balanced book. It's generally very sympathetic to Marx, and he discusses some interesting things I didn't know, like the correspondence that Marx carried on later in life with Heinrich Gretz, one of the towering Jewish historians of the 19th century. And in it, Avineri says you see that Marx actually takes an interest. You can see him taking an interest in Jewish history and the Jews, including an interest in the contemporary Jewish community of Jerusalem at that time. At the time, the Jews of Jerusalem were, I believe, constitute the plurality of Jerusalem, meaning the largest, not the majority of the population, but the largest segment of Jerusalem's population. And Marx is interested in these things. Anyway, it's really readable. I highly recommend Avineri. Of course, Avineri had written a book and had written about Marx a lot since the 1960s. This is sort of the culmination of a lot of his scholarship. Those are my thoughts about on the Jewish question. I don't know. I don't think I said anything especially original, by the way. I'm going to be clear about that. I don't think I said anything original. I'm just telling you what I think of the essay, and I do believe there are many other scholars who think of it similarly.
Thanks, Tony. We're running low on time or close to time. So I actually have one question, but then I hope maybe if you keep it brief enough, there could be another question added.
I'll keep it brief.
I just want to return to, but my question is also maybe too big for it, so I apologize in advance. I want to return to the present.
Okay.
And specifically, you mentioned, there might be a new Jewish question today, but yet it seems like its relation to the socialist movement is much more obscure than it was in this era of the Second International. You mentioned like the conflict over Zionism and October 7th, but actually I think it'll be quite rare to think like there's discussion, one state solution, two state solution, this endless debates, but the socialist movement seems to be not a non-factor, right? And even today, there are Jewish political organizations. The first one that comes to mind is Jewish Voices for Peace. But I think I'd be quite hard pressed to say that's the new Jewish Labour Bund of today. So yeah, I don't know. But I feel like actually you might actually share a similar sentiment, even because you mentioned like the loss of a liberal establishment, right? A liberal mainstream view of Jews being integrated into American society. So like what does socialism have to offer? I guess to have a final question, what does socialism have to offer the Jewish on the so-called Jewish question? Is there potential for socialism? Yeah.
Say it again, Desmond. What's the last part?
Is there a potential for the Jewish question to have a relation in the present with a socialist movement?
Well, there is the potential's there, but those who call themselves socialists will have to want to do that. For them to want to do that, they will first have to take anti-Semitism seriously. They will have to say, look, we see it as a problem, whether it's on the right, left, or both. You have to see it as a problem, and then go about analyzing the problem and coming up with some sort of political approach to it. So I'm saying if socialists want to see it that way, then there's the potential to develop. Now, obviously I hope they do. In my view, anti-Semitism is a problem. Second, I hope socialists will come back to the discussions of Jewish national self-determination as Marxists and other socialists developed their approach to that in the first half of the 20th century. Clearly, socialists take an interest in what's happening in that part of the world. There's no question about that. There's a great deal of interest in it. So that's not the issue. The issue is going to be to what degree can socialists develop an analysis that is applicable to reality in the Middle East, A, and B, come up with an approach that in no way, shape, or form indulges anti-Semitism. So these, to me, are the challenges of a socialist approach to the question of Israel and Israel-Palestine. Again, two things. One, something that's relevant to that region, that pays attention to the realities of that complicated region, and something that doesn't indulge in anti-Semitism, analysis that is free of anti-Semitism. This to me is a challenge, I think, facing socialists.
May I ask one last question?
Sure. I can stay longer.
I'm curious what you think about, to move to a somewhat more academic, what do you think about the politics of Jewish studies now? I mean, I noticed that there's been recently from the more conservative elements of the American Jewish community, an attack on Jewish studies as a field as too liberal, etc. I'm wondering what you think of that, and generally the way Jewish studies is understood and how it's situated politically, including tensions within it.
Yeah,
that's another big subject.
Yeah, it's I would say it's hard right now to make a generalization about this for a few reasons. One, Jewish studies is pretty big now, diverse. There isn't an open discussion about all the questions you raised. So that's one thing. There isn't. I mean, there's some discussion, but I think it has to be more open and sustained before we know, before I could anyway, make some confident and comprehensive generalizations. But I have a couple of thoughts. One is this. One is that I think Jewish studies by and large, doesn't seem to have a conscious, articulated sense of purpose or mission the way Jewish studies did from the 19th century to roughly the 1990s. There were different understandings between the mid-19th century and the mid to late 20th century about what Jewish studies should be doing. Jewish studies should, according to some, contribute to the effort of the struggle for equal rights. That's a 19th century German view. There is a view among, let's say, the Yiddish scholars in the 20s and 30s that Jewish studies should help emancipate the Jewish working class. They should understand themselves as a nation and a nation, or a nation and a class, and that scholarship, Jewish scholarship, will help that process of Jewish national self-awareness in the struggle, the larger social struggles. Jewish history should develop, according to another perspective, a proper understanding of the Jewish past, so they can help build the Jewish future in Palestine, Israel, or somewhere else. So these are different ways in which the study of Jews was related to contemporary political agendas. These are a strong sense of purpose. In the United States, what I call the liberal approach, I would say, had a purpose in saying, look, you can be fully integrated. The purpose of that scholarship was often to show how Jews could be fully integrated and accepted in the United States and remain a distinct Jewish ethnic group. All right. Now, I don't know. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any general shared approach. I'm not sure how many individuals even have their own approaches. I'm not sure. It seems to me Jewish studies, in a sense, is stuck. That's one perception. Another perception, this applies mainly to the American Jewish field, but maybe others, is something like this. The old view, again, the liberal view that I described, was that Jews came, they struggled, they succeeded, and this is wonderful. It shows America, how great America it is, that they can accept the Jews. It says something about this country. And it says a lot that's positive about Jews, that they could maintain themselves in a condition of prosperity and freedom and all that. Now, there seems to be an inverted view that says, yes, Jews came, they struggled, they succeeded, and but it's not wonderful. The Jews became white, they became implicated in American social justice, and what previously people celebrated as success and contribution to America is now seen as being implicated in America and all its injustices. That's a more recent trend that I hadn't seen 20 years ago. So that is something I'm saying. But again, I don't seem to me, I don't see a kind of, like I said, a renewal, a purpose in the big sense. There are a lot of changes in method and topics and themes. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to describe a static approach. I'm not saying we're in stasis. I'm saying that there doesn't seem to be, again, a collected shared purpose, or even several different schools of thought that you could identify as schools of thought in Jewish studies. I could be wrong here, but that seems to me where we're at in the 21st century. I've suggested already, and I want to reiterate this, that one possible rejuvenating element could be an engagement or re-engagement with Marxism. That's just one. It's not the only approach to be taken, but I don't think Marxism, even though it died out mostly after World War II within Jewish studies, I don't think it exhausted itself. I don't know. I think we should be looking to see what can be preserved, saved, renewed, continued.
Thank you, Tony. Ben, you can ask your question.
I wanted to ask a follow-up around the Marx on the Jewish question, which is just a quick clarification of, do you find the anti-Semitism in that essay to be purely rhetorical, or do you think something more substantive in the argument in that essay, just in that essay, is substantively anti-Semitic? And also, just as a follow-up to that, to Marx on the Jewish question too, there's also been a revival of interest in the historian, more of a historical sociologist, Yuri Slezkin, who's like the chair of, I think, Russian studies at UC Berkeley. His book, The Jewish Century. Yeah. Like recently, also there was a glowing tablet reappraisal. Tablet magazine had a reappraisal of his book, and that also, I think, covers similar ground to, but more sociological than I think where you've been talking about the Jews' involvement in the Russian and the American left. Mm-hmm. And what do you make of that? And what do you make of the revival of it by, like, or what do you think? What do you think we should make of that? Is sort of a indicative of the present.
The question of clarification. I do view the anti-Semitism as primarily rhetorical, but genuine. Do you understand what I mean by that? I mean, in other words, I think Marx seems to me to share that attitude, the anti-Semitic attitude, but it's rhetorical because I don't think the anti-Semitic verbiage is essential to the argument. Again, I think you could have made the argument without it and nothing would change. So I don't think the anti-Semitic verbiage is essential, but I do think it reflects some negative feelings on his part towards Jews, at least at that stage in his life. That's what I was trying to say. Slezkin, what recent, you mentioned a magazine that recently reappraised it, I think you said. What magazine's that?
Yeah, Tablet magazine. They've come out, I think they're relatively recent, but they've been like an American Jewish politics culture magazine.
And to tablet, okay, I want to find that. So that, okay, I'll look for that in
I
tablet.
believe it's called Jewish Vulgarity is the name of the article.
Okay, thank you. What do I make of Slezgin? The Jewish Century. So parts of the book I think are excellent. I think it was really very interesting material in it on the incorporation of large number of Jews into the early Soviet state. That part of the book I remember being very, very interesting. However, he does do it in a cavalier way. I understood a Russian historian, a historian who's an expert in Russia, told me that liberal Russian historians, I was told this 20 years ago, that liberals in Russia see it as an anti-Semitic book because it feeds into this idea of a Judeo-Bolshevik, Judeo-Bolshevism, that the Russian Revolution was a kind of Jewish plot. And Slezgin doesn't say that, but if you want to see things that way, you can certainly interpret his book that way. So it gives me some pause, even though, again, I myself learned a lot from his discussion of the 1920s. Really, this is the 1920s and the influx of Jews who went into the Soviet state bureaucracy and why. What I don't like about the book, by the way, I also think he doesn't understand Zionism and culture at all. As I recall, he makes some comments about Zionists sort of wanting to culturally wall themselves off from the world, when in fact it was just the opposite. The idea was to create a Hebrew-speaking culture that was deeply engaged and open with the entire world and incorporating it in a Hebrew cultural social system. So I don't think he understood what the Zionists were up to. A book I'd recommend is by Kenneth Moss, who teaches at University of Chicago, who's written about this in his first book about Jews and the Russian Revolution. I think that's will give you a really incisive understanding of what a lot of Zionist cultural activists and thinkers were trying to do. But what I think is basically wrong with the Jewish Century is reflected in the title. He views the Jewish Century as this incredible, this is how I remember the book anyway, is this incredible moment in which the Jews just rose to the top everywhere, whether it's America or Russia or whatever. It's the Jews are taking advantage of modernity. And we should really see modernity as this wonderful victory for the Jews. I think modernity is more complex. I think what he should have done, how I would see modernity, let me put it that way, is defined by extremes. Modernity is defined by extremes, positive and negative. It's a period, the 20th century, or much of it, starting in the late 19th century, whatever time frame you want to use. You see two things: a spectacular rise of some Jews in some countries into positions of power politically, to being very influential in the arts and literature and culture, and important in the realm of business and the economy, and we could go on. I mean, at times quite astounding, astoundingly successful in these ways. And then in the same time, in the same era, it's a period of annihilation. And I'm not just talking about the Holocaust, but the Holocaust, of course, is the primary example. I mean, there's tremendous violence against Jews. Pogroms, there's the Russian Civil War in which Jews are slaughtered on a mass scale. There is the Holocaust. You can't treat one or the other, in my opinion, as exceptional or minor without greatly distorting the whole era. The era is both those things. That's what I'm trying to say. So I would have liked to see a story that deals with both in equal measures. What does it say about modernity? Not only that Jews rise high in the Soviet government for a while, actually. We know where things go later and it's not happy. But all right, so what does it say, even taking Slezgin on his own terms? what is this century in which Jews rise in some places and are exterminated in other places? And what does it say that the Jewish question to this day has not been solved? It hasn't been solved because much of the world, there are sections of the world, including the United States, in which one solution offered to the plight of the Jews, which is to create which is national self-determination, is adamantly opposed. So one part of the Jewish question is still burning right in front of us. And so I go back to this point I was making before, that it seems to me what modernity is about is extremes. Extremes, clashes, contradictions, and radical divergences that, again, could say that lead people to say or observe that, wow, modernity's been great for Jews. Let's look at the United States to prove that. Some say, let's look at the Soviet Union. Others will say Israel. Others might say France. And then others can say, God, modernity is awful for the Jews. Look what happens to them. Well, both are real, and I'd like to see an approach that takes the totality and then not just the totality, but sees it, again, I keep using these terms, but it's the best I can do, as an era defined by these really extreme contrasts. That's my view of modernity, and I don't think it accords, I don't think it matches Slezgin's understanding of modernity. I think it's actually qualitatively different.
Thank you, Tony. Do you have time for one final question? We have a question from our side. So Luke, do you want to ask?
Thank you. Earlier in the discussion, you mentioned that Lenin, in criticizing the Jewish Bund, was almost anti-Semitic, not quite. Now, other leaders of the Second International were very strongly anti-Zionist, for various reasons. How do you see the distinction between these historical socialists and the current campus protests?
Okay. Quick thing about Lenin. So I don't think Lenin was an anti-Semite. I do want to say that there's another great book by another University of Chicago professor. Oh, geez, I just forgot the Utopia's. Geez, my mind just went blank. Anyway, some Bolsheviks did sometimes talk about Bundists in anti-Semitic terms. Faith Hillis, sorry. It's Faith Hillis's book on Russian exiles in Western Europe. And she does discuss some disturbing references to the way Russian Social Democrats, specifically Bolsheviks, talked about Bundists. This is in the pre-1917 period, and did talk about them in anti-Semitic stereotypical terms. So I want to mention this. I'd be remiss if I didn't. So, question of Zionism and the contemporary protests. Okay, so I think the way to understand, so I think there's a big difference between the early, pre-48 anti-Zionism and the contemporary anti-Zionism on the whole, especially as we see it manifested in the campus protests. So a couple of things to understand about the early anti-Zionists. First, they were anti-Zionists in part because they thought it wasn't practical. In other words, they saw there were serious Jewish problems. The Bund, for instance. They saw there were serious Jewish problems that needed addressing. But their one concern they had is that Zionism didn't address them. That Zionism had this, what Bundists thought is a kind of impractical, ridiculous scheme. The Jewish homeland can't exist in this corner of the world that is not economically developed. So how is this corner of the world going to absorb millions of Jews? All right, that's a question. Not only Bundists asked that, but others. It's a question any Marxist would ask in 1900 or 1910. So Palestine does not have the potential to absorb huge numbers of Jews. Jews aren't going to evacuate where they live anyway. That's another part of this criticism about the impracticality of it. So that's one thing to keep in mind. It was viewed as impractical. It was viewed as a distraction from the problems Jews faced. And of course, in the case of the Bund, they share with Zionism a conviction that Jews are a nation. Right? So that's important to keep in mind. They're starting from at least one shared premise, and that is that Jews are a nation and they need national rights. Okay, let me say something more about this earlier period. After World War I, there is the beginning of some change. Again, I attribute it to at least two things. One, that socialist Zionism becomes ascendant in Palestine. Two, elements in the Second International start to adopt a friendlier attitude because, again, of the socialist prominence of socialist Zionism, but also because of the Balfour Declaration. Now it makes it hard because England says, we view with favor, I think I'm quoting verbatim now, we view with favor the establishment of a Jewish homeland, and then provided it doesn't infringe on the rights of the local population. You know, it's harder to say that Zionism isn't practical anymore. You know, in other words, there might be other reasons to object to Zionism, but the practicality argument becomes less convincing after England takes over Palestine from Ottoman Turkey. So you start to see some changes in thinking. The third change in thinking comes with the rise of Nazism, where what I would cite is one striking, well, what you start to see is that various kinds of socialists, including revolutionary Marxists, are starting to say, you know what, we can imagine now a Jewish homeland of some kind, somehow. Maybe Jews should emigrate wherever they can, and that includes Palestine. So one thing that starts to happen is the question of Zionism or the future of or the possibilities, the question of Zionism in Palestine starts to get parsed. So you have some Marxists, and this is what I mean. Some Marxists are saying, we don't want a Jewish homeland, but Jews have the right to immigrate to Palestine. And some become quite convinced of that. They're quite strongly convinced that Jews should be allowed to go because anyone should be allowed to cross national borders, especially a persecuted people. They should be allowed to go anywhere, and that includes Palestine. And the Jews really need it anyway. All right. You start to see that. Now, those same people don't necessarily support the creation of a Jewish state, but they do believe Jews should have the right to go to Palestine freely. Then you have others, again, in this parsing of the question of a Jewish national self-determination. You have others who are saying, well, Jews are a nation. They're forming into a nation in Palestine. Maybe they need some form of national rights there, if not a full-fledged state. You know, and then others are saying, no, Jews need a full-fledged state. And then the question is, what kind of state and all that stuff. So you have, I would say, two things going on. One, an increasing openness towards Zionism, coming from different kinds of Marxists and socialists. And second, a more, let's call it, I don't know, let's call it a more nuanced view of the issues involved when it came to Palestine. And again, that has to do with a way of imagining Jewish rights in different ways there. And then finally, of course, almost all socialists, this includes communists, not all Trotskyists, but a lot, start to say, in America, a good number of Trotskyists, start to say by 47, 48, Jews deserve a state, that this is the only way to solve the plight of the Jews, is through the creation of some kind of state. And so by 48, this is the mainstream position in the United States and many other countries. Of course, a lot of this has to do with the Soviet Union pushing this to the forefront. You know, Jewish statehood is pushed to the forefront by the Soviet Union in 47 and 48. So this plays a big role in how the left broadly comes to support the establishment of a Jewish state. So there is, all this is to say that the overall trajectory from 1897, let's say, the establishment of the World Zionist Congress in 1897 to 1947, 48, when the UN says we should England should pull out of Palestine and Palestine should be divided into Jewish and Arab majority states, the overall trajectory, and it's not a linear trajectory, it's not an inexorable one. I'm just saying where most socialists wind up in that 50-year period. Is it 50 years? Whatever, from 1897 to 1947, where most socialists wind up is saying we accept or endorse the creation of a Jewish state. So that's the dynamic, or that's the direction of the left. I have to say one other thing that plays a role. It's just an example. It's sort of, when Trotsky in the 30s says in several interviews that, look, I oppose Zionism, but after there's revolution on a global scale, yeah, sure, Jews should have a homeland. They should have a homeland. It can't be secured through imperialism, Trotsky says. It can only be secured through socialist revolution. But it's an interesting and important change to go from saying, no, the Jews aren't a nation, they don't deserve national rights, to saying Jews are a nation. And they do deserve a homeland of some kind, but it can't be achieved the way Zionists want it to be achieved. That's Trotsky's opinion in the 30s. So again, I'm citing this as an example of the change. Now, today, so between 47 and 67, no one on the left in the United States really is saying Israel should be destroyed in any way. First of all, they're not paying that much attention to Israel generally, but to the extent they are paying attention to Israel during that period, Israel's an established fact. People on the left might not call themselves Zionists. Marxists probably don't call themselves Zionists, but they don't seem to be calling themselves anti-Zionists if anti-Zionism means the dismantling of Israel or its destruction. They oppose that fundamentally. After 67, the left in the United States, or elements of the left in the United States, go towards a different kind of anti-Zionism, which one that endorses maximal Palestinian nationalist claims. And those claims involve the eradication of Jewish self-determination. Now, I don't mean to say that's an overwhelming view after 67. It is a view.
Which were never endorsed by the Soviet Union.
Which was never endorsed by, exactly,
right.
endorsed by the Soviet Union. So it's just an element. And it's an element that does gain ground at different moments over time to the present. So what I see is different today is just that. It's just that. It's the difference between opposing a hypothetical right prior to 1947. The hypothetical right is Jewish national self-determination in Palestine. It's one thing to oppose that right. It's another thing to say that right must be taken away, quote, by any means necessary. Slogan we often hear. So it's anti-Zionism rather today is fundamentally different from the old anti-Zionism, I would argue, for just this reason. A right is being the demand is that this right must be taken away, and that's a right that only can be achieved through extreme violence, and that again points to the second difference that goes back to what I said before. The earlier anti-Zionists did not seek to harm Jews in any way, shape, or form. A problem they had with Zionism is it wasn't solving the problems that afflicted Jews, according to the critique. Now you have another approach which says, look, if Jews need to be slaughtered, then that's what happens. Revolution isn't pretty. What's the expression? Decolonization is not a metaphor. So the whole orientation is different from because the reality is different between today and this earlier era prior to World War II or prior to 48 or prior to 1917, kind of pick whichever date you want. So I think the differences are great, actually. between the old anti-Zionism and the new anti-Zionism, because reality has changed so greatly.